Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to do a follow-up on a series on basically problematic clinical supervision. In one that was talking about quote-unquote more conservative or anti-relational or transactional models, I alluded to this like, hey, not everybody starts this way as a supervisor. And that's what this episode is going to be all about, is like, how do people become this way? And I think I've distilled it into kind of three general categories. They're not all encompassing categories, but maybe it's helpful to get to kind of think generally, how do people get to be this way? How do supervisors, get to be more transactional in nature? They don't always start this way. I do want to note, though, do some of them start this way? Yeah. I mean, it's the same reason why you can find really bad therapists and really bad consultants and all sorts of stuff, is because they're in it for the quote unquote wrong reasons. They're in it for power. They're in it for authority. They'll sell you a different ticket and say, this is what I'm actually about. But in reality, that's all they're really about. And I think I have an episode that's like rotten supervision and just, there are straight up bad leaders that should never be given power, or there should be a lot more oversight before they're given free reign. But to me, the vast majority falls into these other camps. So what are the reasons? Number one is a pretty simple one. It's essentially what was modeled to them. Now, I'm not going to give people a full pass on this, because to me, if a more transactional, anti-relational method was modeled to you, I would bargain it wasn't necessarily that's the only reason. There is a backdrop of this, professionally and or personally, that condones this as being normative in some sort of way. Folks who are just relational forward, equity forward, communication, empathy forward aren't going to magically shift supervision styles or just kind of drink the Kool-Aid that a transactional model is normal simply because that's what they experience. My argument would be there's probably this sort of more conservative, socially conservative mindset already in place of like, I like things to be safe. If things get too touchy, intimate, that's not going to be safe. Professionalism is the is the thing that we worship, and professionalism is a white lab coat without a lot of person in the role, which I guess in some professions might make sense, but in the world of psychology is incredibly dangerous. So again, is it a plausible methodology as to, or not methodology, but a plausible track as to how someone becomes this more transactional, anti-relational supervisor? Yeah, but my challenge to anyone who falls into that camp is like, why did you drink that Kool-Aid? Why was that so normative to you, particularly when the field it's almost gone the opposite direction. It's a fad now to be relational, and that's why see in my kind of relational supervision model, it's dangerous in the hands of people who really aren't equipped to do it. But in the very least, you could be a little bit person forward. The field is begging that of you all the time. Never mind, your supervisees are taught sort of ideologies similar to it. So a little bit of a shame on you, I guess, if you're a supervisor drinking that Kool-Aid with no second thoughts about it whatsoever. You should be reflecting more. You should be looking up models that even non-relational psychodynamic models would suggest some degree of relational presence, in the very least, for diversity-related reasons, that not everybody walks the same walk of life as you, and you have to be interested in the person. Anyway, I digress. That's number one. Number two is a defensive reaction to some sort of relational dynamic that they feel insecure about. And so the idea is that a supervisor might begin more relationship forward. They might be, if anything, actually a little too casual about how they're approaching the person relationally. Now, the big caveat here is they probably are doing this without any model in mind, or a very vague sense of what the model is like. Well, I'm just going to be human with them. I'm going to buddy. But they're absolutely ignoring power dynamics. They're absolutely ignoring authority. They're absolutely ignoring that there is still, even in relational models, a method and a precision to how you talk to your supervisee. You can't just like shoot the shit completely and like go out and get drinks with them for funsies. Like, it's not the same. You have to. Relational psychodynamic methods talk explicitly about this because they understand the danger of not appreciating these things. And so what these types of supervisors will often do is they create their own, perceived victimhood. They operate in a way that becomes quote unquote inappropriate to the supervisee. And the supervisee ends up being like, this person seems not safe, right? They're way too personal. And so I'm going to find some other avenue or mechanism to complain about this person. Not because it's an indictment and that they should be removed. They're not like fire and brimstone, but basically the feedback gets its way back to the supervisor, and they have a defensive response of like, well, why didn't they come to me? And I thought we were on the same page, and I thought, X, Y, and Z. The worst case scenario is they then retaliate against the supervisee. But the best case scenario for these types of folks is often just to pull back and be like, I'm going to be less relational. I'm going to dot my I's and cross my T's, and I'm going to expect you to dot your I's and cross your T's. And that's what supervision is going to be right now. It's a transaction. You tell me what you need. I will respond to the need, and that allows me to defend myself. That, hey, I wrote down, that's what you needed. I responded. I did not respond out of, in some sort of off-color way or whatever it might be. What sometimes also happens is the supervisee, because of the lack of safety of like, I guess this is what we're doing. We're not naming anything. They're not giving me any permission around feedback. They're just relating to me like we're buddy-buddy. Is at the end of the year, at the end of their supervision, they give the feedback because that's when it's safer. They're on their way out. They don't need as much. And they'll say, hey, what was this about? I don't know if I really, truly appreciated this methodology. I didn't really truly appreciate how you spoke about this type of person or this type of client, which also could have been the other feedback that was, delivered indirectly sooner. And so there's like, well, what, you should have told me this sooner and I could have done something, ignoring their lack of intentionality. And so again, they then go, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to open myself up, ignoring how important, if you have a frame and a methodology around that, how important it is to model that. Well, I'm not going to do this anymore. Rather than refine my more relational forward approach, which is not unwise, I'm going to reflexively pull back and not do that anymore. What sometimes can come up is also friction between supervisees. So say if the supervisor is in a committee, or if there's multiple supervisees, they don't play mediator well. They're negligent to the group. They might be okay-ish one-on-one, but they're negligent to group dynamics. And so while they might be okay one-to-one, there becomes a big conflict in the group, and they're like, well, shoot, the more open I am and just like, hey, self-govern, we're all going to trust each other, right? High five. And then big conflict erupts between, a bunch of supervisees or just two supervisees. And it's just like, it gets too hot to handle. Then they're like, well, we're going to clamp down. Clearly, y'all can't be trusted to be open. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come in with a clinical case. We're going to play it safe. And if there's any conflict, we're going to take that offline, and we're going to make sure that there's resolution, and we're all going to be professionals, right? And it inadvertently, again, usually this is not the intention, is just shooting psychological safety in the foot, as the popular term goes these days. And it's just encouraging people to be more transactional. It encourages the training system itself to become more transactional. Never mind that group interaction might change the environment on the one-on-one side. I'll say too, I guess, I should note the relational feedback. There also sometimes are administrative slights that happen. So this is unusually common, it feels like. But say like the supervisor is giving a lot of latitude around note completion, those sorts of things, which does matter. I mean, there are fiscal possible consequences of not being on top of things administratively. Hey, I am assuming you're getting these signatures. I'm assuming you're completing the notes within 48 hours or whatever the policy might be. And then there's a quote unquote betrayal, which there's a problem in the use of that language, but there's a felt betrayal that the supervisee is not actually following through. And rightfully, that's upsetting to a supervisor, but then they clamp down and they abandon the relational approach completely because there's an administrative issue. And what that inadvertently communicates is like, you have to do the administrative kind of more technical work or I'm not going to give you anything relational. You can technically still do both. Is there a different energy dispersion around relational versus administrative because you do need to be more intentional and more mindful about administrative oversight? Yes, but that doesn't mean you have to abandon a relational person-centered approach, whatever model it is that you're ascribing to. So that's kind of a more benign version of how this happens. I think the more typical ones is it's something beyond the administrative. Again, there's something more core, identity, intention, something very personal that tends to create this. Nope, I'm not going to be. I'm going to be more transactional in nature. Last but not least, I want to give permission around that there are indeed circumstances where supervisees are weaponizing something and they are absolutely a loose cannon, and the supervisor is in best intent doing a reasonable job, but the fieriness of the circumstance causes them to pull back. Now, I want to be abundantly clear, this is not incredibly common. If you're listening from a certain political ideology, or perhaps you yourself have been hurt by this, this kind of saliency effect when we talk about judgment and heuristics. Just because a plane crash happened doesn't mean that the stats around how frequent plane crashes actually happen change. So I need to note that this is not like, everybody's just kind of woke and running around slinging insults and, everybody's an oppressor now. I have not heard this a bunch, but have I seen some issues come up where the supervisor or the committee is doing the best they can and some supervisors just light some damn bonfires and everybody's like, oh my God, 100%. Now the key here is like, the power still rests in the supervisor, and if they truly trust and believe in the frame, they should be able to stick to the frame and stick to their approach and not just abandon ship because things get dicey. It is, there's appropriate guilt and shame when someone just reflexively abandons their approach. In this case, again, it's more common because it's legitimately, you line up 10 supervisors, 10 out of 10 are like, that feels like a bonfire, not of your own creation, but oh my gosh, that's going to be challenging. But, there still is this responsibility to be like, don't abandon ship just because things get hard. As I say around the relational frame, one, not everybody should do it, but two, it's easy to do when things go well. It is hardest to do when conflict arises. And so how do you keep at it just because someone is weaponizing some aspect of demographics and making accusations towards you or committee that there is some sort of like inappropriate conduct, when in reality it was a normal conflict, something that easily navigated. All we have to do is hold dialectical space with one another and we'll probably be okay. It is a betrayal of the frame, which is why it's so important. If you're approaching a more relational model, you need to have some sort of defensible theory that you're doing this for some sort of reason. And that makes it easier to stick to it because it's like, I'm doing a specific methodology. There is clearly a path towards resolution that the supervisee is not taking, or they've not taken after 3 separate occasions to potentially rectify this. I'm honoring my power and I'm inviting them relationally to try to come into the fold. But if they reflexively continue to throw punches, at some point, yes, I do have to abandon my approach. But the more frequent outcome, I think, is the minute there's something too fiery, too hot to touch that feels oppressive in nature, feels possibly tied to litigation, the supervisor or the system will abandon. And then there will be a trickle effect on future supervisees, how they engage future supervisees, is they'll take a more conservative approach. And perhaps what's most challenging about this is the future supervisees are subjected to a mixed message, that the supervisor or the committee or the system will continue to deliver this sort of more relational, approachable, open methodology, but the subtext says something very different because of the hurt that preceded it. These are the stickiest situations, but I also find them to be pretty redeemable because there's that kind of initial foundation of truly a supervisor doing a good job and putting their best self forward, but a bad circumstance is leading them astray. A lot of consultation, supervision of supervision, those sorts of things can really help those circumstances so that these outliers don't begin to define what might otherwise be a pretty darn healthy Supervisory approach, never mind a supervisory system or training program. So, just to recap, that's all I've got for those. I mean, again, it's an oversimplification, but the three methods or three means or processes through which people become more transactional supervisors are one, it's what's modeled to them. But again, if you listen to it, there's some other stuff going on there. It's not just what's being modeled to them. Two, there's the defensive lack of humility, something relational or maybe even administrative happens, and the supervisor or system immediately abandons ship out of self-protection. And number three is the more, I don't know, I have more compassion for, is like truly a big fire comes up that any supervisor would have a challenge around, and rather than sticking to it, they abandon ship out of necessary self-protection, or what feels like necessary self-protection. But they could have split the difference, right? They could have dotted I's and crossed T's because it's an objective bonfire that's going off, but not truly and fully abandon the frame so quickly, at least. And then, as I said, there's some residual effects, sadly, that often follow that. So, I don't know if I'm ending with recommendations, but the general idea here is, if you're a supervisee, hopefully this is helpful in kind of trying to like maintain perspective around a supervisor. There are certainly those that rightfully, be on guard and be careful about, but there also could be other circumstances that like, hey, things could get pretty touchy and hot, and it is not easy always in the role of a supervisor. Whereas if you're a supervisor and you find yourself being defensive or being really conservative in how you're approaching your supervisee because of a bad experience, get help, get assistance. This is 101. If we expect our clients and we expect our supervisees to seek help when something challenging comes up, why would we not do the same in a role as a supervisor? We can't always know and see these things ourselves. We sometimes need outside help. So, for whatever that's worth, I hope this is useful and interesting, and as always, stay curious.